I'd like to just make a brief introduction to John Seabrook. Here's his bio with a few of his titles. He's the author of The Song Machine Inside the Hit Factory, published by Norton in October 2015. He is also the author of No Brow, The Culture of Marketing, The Marketing of Culture. It was published in 2000. He's the author of Beeper, My 2-Year Odyssey in Cyberspace. It was published in 1997. And Flash of Genius and Other True Stories of Invention, published in 2008. He has been a contributor to The New Yorker since 1989 and became a staff writer in 1993. And you can visit his articles on his website, which is johnseabrook.com. He explores the intersection between creativity and commerce in the fields of technology, design, and music. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and 2 children and a dog and a cat. John Seabrook.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Joe. And let me just say at the outset that it's a real pleasure to be speaking about this topic to people like you who know what I'm talking about. Because when you get about 50 miles from here and you say Seabrook Farms, I mean, maybe they've had the cream spinach, but you usually have to do a lot of explaining, you know, what you're talking about. So thank you for coming and thank you for your interest. I also want to thank Warren Adams and the staff here at the Cumberland County Historical Society for offering me the opportunity to speak to you today about some of my recent research into Seabrook Farms and C.F. Seabrook, who was my grandfather. Some of the most enjoyable hours I've spent doing this research have actually been spent right here in this room, which is a lovely room. And the people you meet in here, including Warren and Brittany and Joe and Jean and Bill, all around doing their thing while I'm doing my thing, often with help from them. It was really very pleasurable hours spent, so thank you for that. Also, I will say another great treasure of this place is the collection of local newspapers that they have here, both on microfilm and in that room in paper form. This is a wonderful resource for any local historian or family historian who's trying to understand the world that their ancestors grew up in and to really capture the flavor of earlier times. Having multiple newspapers to draw from also gives the researcher multiple points of view on a person or an issue. And if that person is C.F. Seabrook, he receives unfailingly positive press from Bridgeton Evening News, and he really can't catch a break in the Violent Daily Journal. So I have therefore developed a much more rounded and nuanced view of my topic, really all thanks to the newspaper archive here. And I actually feel sad when I think of researchers in the future having only nj.com to look at. It just doesn't give you anything like that kind of flavor that the actual newspapers give. So anyway, thanks to this place. So today is the first of a series of lectures that I'm going to give on different chapters in the life of Charles Franklin Seabrook, who lived from 1881 to 1964. My primary reason for doing this is to make the Seabrook Farms story, here I should advance my slides, more accurate as well as more inclusive of other groups. I'm now the president of the board of the Seabrook Educational and Cultural Center in Upper Deerfield. And as we look into upgrading our museum and our archive, I'm going through the story we tell in the museum and trying to bring it more in line with the historical record of what actually happened here. We badly need to replace the corporate public relations version of the Seabrook Farms story, which we rely heavily on in the museum now, with something closer to the truth, painful though the truth may sometimes be. I've expanded on this part of my project in the winter 2019 SECC newsletter, which I think there's going to be a stack of around here by the end that you can take home a copy and read if you're interested. So, On a personal level, I would like to leave the Seabrook story in better shape than I found it, in terms of accuracy, fairness, social justice, and historical context. And if that means taking a little of the shine off of Granddad's halo, so be it. The old man never looked good in a halo anyway. I am the second to the last of C.F. Seabrook's 13 grandchildren. He died when I was 5, and although we frequently visited the big house, as we called it, on Pope Lane, to see my grandmother, Norma Dale Ivins, we didn't see much of him. However, in memory, Granddad was never far away. I heard lots of stories about his many accomplishments growing up. Some of the best stories were not from my family, but from C.F.'s old cronies, like his longtime and faithful worker, Jonas McGalliard, who served C.F. in various positions, including driver. I remember Jonas saying that Granddad not only thought big, he wrote big, too. In particular, he didn't write normal-sized numbers. He made giant ones so that when he wrote a number down, Jonas said, you knew that it was down. To a kid trying to imagine the grandeur that had been Seabrook Farms, and confusingly no longer existed, here was something that I could grasp. Granddad made his numbers big. It was partly because I grew up with these stories of invention and industry within my own family, such as the ingenious boil-in-the-bag method of cooking frozen cream spinach that was developed at Seabrook Farms. I became a professional storyteller myself. Eventually, I got to write for The New Yorker, where I often reported on inventors and industrialists in various forms, men not unlike my mental image of my grandfather. One of those pieces, Flash of Genius, about the inventor of the intermittent windshield wiper, was made into a film by Mark Abraham. In my time at The New Yorker, I have learned to aim for a standard of excellence in reporting, fact-checking, and fact-finding that this great American literary institution is justly famous for. At the magazine, this process is simply called reporting, and it is at the core of what The New Yorker does, made timeless in the work of writers from John Percy, whose Hiroshima first appeared in its pages, to New Jersey's own John McPhee, who, in all his rambles around the state, apparently didn't make it down to Seabrook, New Jersey. He never came out the other side of the Pine Barrens, it seems. At its heart, reporting is the belief that facts really do matter, even when they are inconvenient to go counter to what you think the story is. It's heartening to see this tradition continuing every week in the pages of The New Yorker as young writers come along to keep that faith alive at a time when facts are under assault at every level of our national discourse. So when I turned back to the Seabrook story a few years ago and began to accumulate new information about C.F. Seabrook...
Excuse me, Don, is this on?
No. Are you having trouble hearing me?
Are you having?
Okay, I can...
Hey,
I will slouch a little bit. Not that I like slouching, my mother would like it, but you can hear me better that way, okay? Anyway, so my plan when I turned back to the Seabrook story was to find wherever possible... We're getting some strange noises, Joe. Contemporary sources to check the company's own story against, particularly earlier parts of the Seabrook story, about which much less is known. I had an assistant named Alexandra Kelly Wainwright, known to some in this room as Lexi, who helped me with some of the research. The further into the past we have gone and the more we have learned, the clearer it has become to me that the Seabrook story is wrong on so many key points that the whole thing needs to be overhauled. I came to feel a little like a weekend home improvement warrior who sets out to renovate the breakfast nook and keeps on knocking down walls until he has gutted the whole house. So today I'm going to try to start to put the house back together again by telling the Seabrook story as I think it should be told. I'm starting in the middle, which may be the best part, like the Queen and the Oreo cookie, and it's certainly the part we know least about. I'm talking today about C.F. Seabrook's second career as an international road contractor and civil engineer during the 1920s, when his engineering firm took on multi-million-dollar building jobs both here and abroad, including a disastrous road paving project in Moscow that CF did for the Bolshevik government as part of Stalin's 5-year plan in 1929, I'm going to share never-before-known details of this spectacularly ambitious misadventure, which effectively ended CF's contracting career later in today's presentation. While we're still missing evidence of many of CF's building projects, such as the work in Cuba that my father mentions in his memoir of my father, The Henry Ford of Agriculture, and we're also missing a lot of correspondence that must have attended all these projects. We don't have a single letter from this period. We wonder where it all went. If any of you have it, please bring it in. However, with what we have discovered, I can say with confidence that CF's abbreviated career as a construction engineer was even more extraordinary than his better-known career as a farmer. He was a reluctant farmer at best. He disliked getting his hands dirty, for one thing. He farmed because his father farmed, and because that was all he really knew. But he built roads and other works of civil engineering because he relished the work. And he also enjoyed the life that came with being the head of an international engineering firm. It offered him a way off the land, a chance not only to see the world, but to build parts of it, alongside the leading builders and industrialists of the day, such as Henry Ford himself. So this story starts in 1924. In 1924, C.F. Seabrook, quote, retired unexpectedly, unquote, as the Bridgeton Evening News put it, as the general manager of Seabrook Farms. This was unexpected indeed, because the man sometimes called the Wizard of Bridgeton in the national newspapers, perhaps as a bookend to the Wizard of Menlo Park, Edison himself, who worked at the other end of New Jersey, was then at the peak of his powers. But in spite of the Bridgeton Evening News' best efforts to make it seem otherwise, CF had in fact been fired by his financial backers, the White family of Wall Street, who then declared the business, Seabrook Farms, which they owned, not CF, bankrupt. One of the judges in the bankruptcy proceeding estimated that a total of $5 million had been spent building up Seabrook Farms, and that's $5 million in 1920 money. It's about 14 times more today if you adjust for inflation. Under CF's leadership, which began in 1911, when he bought the farm from his father, AP, for a mere $24,000. At the end of by 1924, after spending all that money, there was only assets worth $500,000 to show for it. CF lost not only his job at the age of 43, but also his investment, and all the local farmers who invested in Seabrook Farms stock, including his own father, lost their money too. So that was the end of what I call Seabrook Farms 1, which lasted from 1893 to 1924. That company was a truck farm that sold fresh produce in city markets and also canned vegetables. Seabrook Farms 2 began in 1930 when CF and a group of investors bought the assets of the old company back from the receivership. And then Seabrook Farms 2 lasted until 1959 when CF sold the company to Siemens. Seabrook Farms 2 is a company that most of you know. It was mainly a frozen food operation that pioneered the mass production of Charles Birdseye's patented method of quick freezing, which the inventor had used only on fish and applied it to the quick freezing of vegetables. The engineering prowess of Belford Seabrook was the key to this company's success during the 30s in particular. After World War II, the company launched the Seabrook Farms brand, which pioneered a number of innovative marketing and branding strategies overseen by my uncle Courtney, who was perhaps the most visionary of the three sons of CF. In the 1950s, my father, Jack Seabrook, was running the company, and that was really the heyday of the business and also its most glamorous period by far, when Hollywood stars such as Ava Gabor and Joseph Cotton were seen at the farm. We'll get to those glory days by the fourth or fifth of these lectures, I promise. The subject of today's talk is the period between Seabrook Farms 1 and Seabrook Farms 2, which I call the interregnum, when CF was out of the farming business altogether and was the head of several contracting companies, mainly road building and landscaping, but also other kinds of infrastructure projects. No job was too big or too difficult for him, it seems. During this period, which lasted from 1924 to 1931, CF was living his best life. He had finally left farming, which he had hated from boyhood, behind him, or so he thought, and he could travel the world. He spent his time in the great capital cities of Europe. There were supposedly Seabrook Engineering branch offices in London, Paris, Berlin, and Moscow. He made multiple ocean crossings each year. It took 8 days to cross by ship in the 1920s, the distance we fly in under 7 hours today. The celebrated passenger ship, the Berengaria, was CF's preferred ocean liner. The huge drawing room of the Berengaria was a laboratory for this farm boy's immersion courses in the manners and mores of the British upper class, the clothes they wore and the wines they poured and the liquors they drank after dinner, their politics and their snobberies, as well as their anti-Semitism. Charlie Seabrook, the sharecropper's son, used this vital information that he assiduously gathered in the Berengaria's drawing room to live like an English feudal lord in Deerfield, New Jersey, transforming the house he purchased on Pope Lane in the mid-20s into a great country estate, complete with the elaborate gardens he'd seen at the great English country estates that he had been invited to for weekends in the 1920s and 1930s. So that's the dining room at the Berengaria. That's CF's dining room. By the 1960s, when I was a boy visiting my grandparents, both the house and gardens were magical. CF also built a fabulous wine cellar for himself in the basement of the house, somewhat ironic in light of the fact that the place is now Seabrook House, so well known to all. He also developed an extensive wardrobe of Savile Row suits that he had tailored on his trips across the pond. CF also taught his children the lifestyle of the Anglo-American ruling class, and my father, Jack, took to it like a duck to water. In creating his own extensive closet and wine cellar, my father at first emulated and then even surpassed his father in the art of living like a British lord by adding horses and carriages to the mix. Living well is the best revenge is an expression my father embraced. I sometimes wonder if the revenge he was talking about was actually on his own father for denying him the chance to run the family business just as he was coming into his prime as chief executive and was in complete command of the company's complex finances. It is interesting to note that my father, like his father, lost his job and career when he was in midlife too. CF himself was the agent of that. During the interregnum period, CF's wife and children often didn't see him for long stretches of time or even know where in the world their father was. In these years, his main business entity was CF Seabrook Engineering, headquartered at 50 Church Street in the Wall Street area of New York City, about 100 yards or so from where my office at the New Yorker is now, on the 38th floor of One World Trade. So this is what 50 Church Street looked like in the 20s. The building was also called the Hudson Terminal, and it was the terminus of the city's once extensive elevated rail system, now all gone except for the High Line Park on Manhattan's west side. And this is what it looks like today. And that's my, the building in the back is One World Trade, so my office is in that building. And I'm about 100, so you can see how close we are to where CF was all those years ago, which I, of course, didn't know until recently. When CF wasn't abroad, his habit was to spend the week in New York, staying at the Engineers Club, located on the south side of Bryant Park, near the public library, and spending the week working in his Wall Street offices, only coming down to the farm on weekends, if at all. So the Engineers Club is the one with sort of the arches kind of in the middle, a little bit to the right. That's seen from across Bryant Park. Oddly, I could see this from my old office at the New Yorker, which was on 43rd Street. I didn't even know what I was looking at for years, but I was actually looking at the place where my grandfather had spent a lot of nights. And then this is the dining room at the Engineers Club, so it's quite grand. The Engineers Club was founded by Andrew Carnegie in 1907, and its members included Thomas Edison, Herbert Hoover, Charles Lindbergh, George Westinghouse, and Nikola Tesla, who CF would have been able to observe feeding pigeons in Bryant Park, as the inventor of alternating current liked to do from time to time. This is how, and then, so that's the dining room. And so that was basically his life. He lived in New York, and he got his work out of New York. So here he is, CF, my grandfather, with the Henry Ford of Agriculture with a steam shovel. Now, if you don't come from a farm background, you might think it's unusual for a man to be both a farmer and a road contractor. As career choices, they might seem to be at opposite ends of the spectrum. The farmer husbands the soil so that it remains fertile year after year. The contractor pours concrete and molten tar over it, ensuring the earth will not grow anything for a long time, if ever. But in fact, farmers were among the first road paving contractors when roads outside of cities began to be paved in the early 20th century. Farmers already had the work crews. For farmers like CF who relied on seasonal farm labor, road building offered an ideal off-season job to keep those workers employed and on the farm. Farmers also often had deposits of stone, gravel, and sand on their land, which could be used to make both concrete and asphalt, which were the two main paving surfaces. And they had the big machines to do the farm work. So farmers actually played a key role in the early paving of America. Of course, they built their roads mainly for business reasons, which was to get their goods to market. And in fact, the Federal Bureau of Public Roads, which was the precursor to the Federal Highway Administration, was a division of the Department of Agriculture until the 1930s. But of course, farmers' roads benefited a lot of other people too. So this is a view of Parsonage Road. CF was living on Parsonage Road at this time. I think it's this, you can see the fences on one side and the other. I believe it's the same road in the early 20s, and you can see the difference that it made when it rained. When dirt roads were muddy, like this one, farmers couldn't get their goods to market, but also doctors couldn't reach the sick. Your social world was severely constrained. Paved roads combined with automobiles changed everything and vastly increased everyone's opportunities and choices. But I'll go back to the earlier slide. This is the peach orchards at Seabrook in 1924 or 25. But in South Jersey in 1924, which is around the time this photograph was taken, roads were also undermining the truck farmers' business, which was based on being the southernmost growing region that could reach New York in a day by rail. With good roads, truck farmers in warmer climates such as Virginia, Georgia, and then Florida could get their goods to the northeastern cities in a day or two also. Partly by road, partly by rail. Today it's, of course, all by road. So the South Jersey farmers lost their advantage. I mean, who would think to grow peaches in South Jersey today? So you might say that CF literally paved the way for Seabrook Farms I's bankruptcy by building such good roads. But I suspect he got more out of road building than he got out of farming, and certainly the numbers were a lot bigger. CF's second career was only possible because in the course of building up Seabrook Farms, he needed to build a lot of roads, and he learned how to do it. He also had experience building 2 railroad spurs on the farm, beginning in 1913. He built 2 spurs, one for each of 2 competing companies. One was for the Pennsy, the other was for the Central Jersey line, so he could play them off against each other and get cheaper prices for his freight. So this is a road cut for one of those. You see, he wasn't fooling around. I mean, it's not just making mud puddles at this point. This is a picture of Seabrook's man building one of those railroad spurs. Note all the mules in the picture. In a lot of these pictures, you see horsepower and machine power coexisting reminding us that in the 1910s, this was a crucial time of transition on the farm when the first wave of mechanization began to break over agriculture, and CF was, of course, right at the forefront of that, and that really was one of the things that made Seabrook Farms what it became. As an aside, I'll just say that I think we're today at another transition time like that, except today it's not the big machines that are changing things, but it's artificial intelligence and data that are coming to the farm. And I think they will change, those technologies are going to change farming as much as the machines that came in the early 20th century changed it. I have a piece in the New Yorker coming out about this in a couple of weeks, so it's actually about a strawberry farmer who tries to build a robot to pick strawberries because he knows that the work is going away and sees that as the future. So if you're interested, look for that. But in these early days, it's sort of horses and steam power. The motor didn't really make it to the farm until the 1920s. The tractors, early tractors were also steam-driven tractors. Actually, CF's father had one. So this is a steam-driven machine, and there are a lot of these pictures. Some of them are here. There's some wonderful pictures here. The New Jersey Digital Highway has a whole bunch of these pictures. It's NewJerseyDigitalHighway.org. And at the Seabrook Center, we have a number of these pictures, too. I think he was very proud of his road building, so he had a lot of pictures taken. So by the early 1920s, CF had built a lot of roads on Seabrook Farms, and the Seabrook Farms infrastructure was mostly in place, so he began looking outside the farm for road building projects. Now this was a big leap because on the farm, CF was the absolute boss of any job, but once he moved to the sphere of public works, building public roads, politicians made those decisions and taxpayers paid the bill, so that was different dynamic. But his timing was very good because after the First World War, the federal government started to pour, and state government started to pour a massive amount of money into paving roads, and Seabrook was right there. There's a saying in the contracting business, the road to success is paved with politics. To win the bids for the job, CF needed political power. Where was he going to find political power? Well, the solution wasn't all that subtle, but it was effective. He got himself made a New Jersey Highway Commissioner. You can see his name right on there as one of the commissioners. Now, he served 2 years as a New Jersey Highway Commissioner, and no sooner had he been installed than he and his fellow commissioners promptly awarded CF's company, Tri-State, with a contract to pave then Route 6 from Bridgeton to Cumberland to the Cumberland-Salem line, now Highway 77, which some of you probably took to get here today. I know we were on it for a while. So these are just some of the many awards that he began to receive from New Jersey to build roads. They were often pieced out in small sections, so that was just a very small section. But he basically built the whole. He was the first to lay the concrete bed for Route 6, now Route 77, and before that it had never been paved. So he basically, was the first to pave that road, and that was his first. That was his first big score, and you can see him doing it right here. The machinery has actually sort of advanced since the mule days a little bit. This is another 8 years or so, and that's the concrete bed he's putting down there in 1921. So that Route 6 was a concrete road, but CF soon moved on to newer, more flexible material, asphalt, which most of the county and state roads were paved in. Asphalt was tricky to work with, and it could crumble if the process wasn't followed correctly and moisture got into the mix, or if the roadbed wasn't properly prepared, as we shall see. But new portable asphalt making machines made the hot rolling process of applying asphalt faster and easier to automate than the cold process of pouring concrete roads, which took more men. When CF built roads around Deerfield, he sometimes bordered them with sycamore trees. such as those that once lined the approach to his house on Polk Lane. The trees gave his roads a stately appearance and also, of course, earned him an additional commission since they came from Coster Nursery, which he owned. We are told that the reason CF preferred sycamores with their distinctive scaly bark was because he had seen and admired the ones growing near the Seine in Paris during his travels in the 1920s. My father also planted sycamores along Griscom and Halltown roads in Mannington, where we lived, maybe to remind him of home. But in my experience, farmers don't much care for trees at the edge of their fields, and they always seem to find ways to accidentally knock them over. Anyway, a lot of those trees that CF planted are gone, but a few actually still remain. As his contracting businesses grew and he needed more road building equipment to take on bigger jobs, CF became the regional distributor for companies that made that equipment. He became the Caterpillar tractor distributor for the entire eastern U.S. and all of Europe. He also had the regional distributorships for Packard motor cars and General Motors trucks. This allowed him to sell the machines to his own contracting companies, which Seabrook Farms then contracted with to build more roads, expanding the business and keeping the workers employed. It was a win-win-win-win situation for CF Seabrook. He also started to get jobs in New York, like this one, on Tongue Mountain, which CF's oldest son, Belford, worked on. Actually, Belford had worked on Route 6 as well when he was 13, according to CF. He headed up a work crew. And then, this is 4 years later, Belford worked up there. Now, this is a very dangerous road. I don't know if any of you know Lake George or Tongue Mountain, but very treacherous, rugged terrain. I think a lot of people would have refused this job. It's also completely infested with rattlesnakes, you know, weirdly for the east. And in fact, there are all these workman comp awards that you can find if you sort of, go through Google that were awarded for this job. And it's a reminder that although a lot of these workers were farm boys, they were actually working with big machinery, and it was quite easy to get hurt. In the next year, Belford was a crew boss for CF in Philadelphia and actually sustained quite a serious injury where he caught his foot in a tractor and broke it in 2 places. What, you might ask, did CF Seabrook actually know about civil engineering? Well, whatever it was, he hadn't learned it in the classroom. There was no evidence that his education lasted longer than 8th grade, and he claimed that he quit school in 3rd grade to work full-time for his father. Early in their marriage, which began in 1905, the same year CF became his father's partner, Norma Dale helped him with some correspondence courses that may have earned him some kind of degree. But for the most part, he learned about engineering on job sites by building things. He was like a builder from an earlier era, before engineering was a science that was studied in schools, but making things stand up was more a matter of an art and a seat of pants reckoning than a science. Now, there are many fields in which being a self-taught person is an entirely admirable thing. A self-taught musician, say, or a self-taught chess player, or let's say a self-taught French speaker even. But a self-taught civil engineer is somewhat less desirable. Some might say that you're not really an engineer until you've been to school and passed the proper certification exams. And CF was certainly never certified by a professional society, although that did not stop him from enjoying the comforts of the Engineers Club in New York. And he could not put down on paper quite how to build a road. He just knew, or if he didn't, he hired people who did know. His real expertise was in knowing how to secure the bids from public officials, and he certainly didn't learn that in school. But CF's lack of formal training, a source of pride to him, was also a liability, one that became more serious as the jobs he bid on got bigger and bigger. At a minimum, he needed credentialed engineers on his payroll who could actually sign off on the work. This arrangement gave rise to one of CF's favorite sayings: Doesn't matter how many degrees you have, it's how many degrees you have working for you that counts. You often said that to John Feudy, as a matter of fact. But in fact, his relatively brief civil engineering career and its disastrous way it ended suggest that his limited education actually did matter. By 1923, CF was no longer a New Jersey highway commissioner. He continued to get road building work in the state, and when the new Delaware River Bridge started to go up at Camden, one of his companies built the Jersey approaches to the later named Ben Franklin Bridge. But there was even bigger game across the river in Philadelphia, where the fairgrounds for the ill-fated Philadelphia Sesqui Centennial were hastily being prepared. This is the layout of the 1926 150th celebration of the Declaration of Independence. The center of Philadelphia, as it looks today, was built on its monumental scale, mostly in the late 19th and early 20th century. The subway, the art museum, and the Beaux-Arts City Hall, all constructed during this period. These projects were marked by massive graft and gave rise to a culture of so-called contractor bosses in Philadelphia. Big Philadelphia builders and local politicians made deals that enriched each other with taxpayers' money, an entrenched culture that lasted for decades. The Sesqui Centennial Exposition was born out of this culture of graft and corruption. In his book Sesqui, historian Thomas Keels calls the Sesqui Exposition, quote, an allegory for the ongoing struggle between the yin and yang of Philadelphia, caught between the gleaming vision of William Penn's virgin settlement and the sordid reality of its pay-to-play politics. It's also part of the ongoing struggle between the yin and yang of C.F. Seabrook, and in Philly, the yang of pay-to-play won out. So this is Robert Vare. He was the boss, the big boss of the Philadelphia Republican political machine, which was called the Organization. Vare's political base and stronghold was swampy South Philadelphia, swampy in those days. Pay-to-play politics and self-dealing was his bread and butter. His own contracting company was rarely without a lucrative building project paid for by the city. Whatever funny business had gone on in the New Jersey Highway Commission when CF was on the board were tiddlywinks compared to the game that Boss Vare was playing in Philadelphia. Sold to the public as a world-class exposition to rival the 1900 Paris Exposition, the Sesqui Centennial was supposed to be located on the Fairmount Parkway in the city's cultural center. But Vare wanted the fair relocated to his South Philly stronghold, and so with less than a year ago, Vare's man in City Hall, Mayor Friedland Kendrick, who was a former pawn shop owner that he had elevated, agreed to the move. According to Thomas Keels, quote, this move alone guaranteed the failure of the fair since it added millions of dollars in development costs and delayed construction, unquote. In addition to widespread graft, the Sesqui was plagued with bad weather and poor attendance. City planners expected 50 million guests, fewer than 5 million came. The fair lost more than $100 million in 1926 money, and the organizing body went bankrupt. According to my father's memoir of his father, CF did 1/3 of all the contracting work for the Sesqui Centennial. How did he get this gig? Here is the old man in his own words, as quoted in the Philadelphia Inquirer in 1928. Our company, he explained, had the contract for most of the work in grading the circle near the Camden approach of the Delaware River Bridge. We were nearly through that contract in the spring of 1926 when we got word that there was trouble at the Sesqui, that Mayor Kendrick wanted to open on the scheduled date, that was going to be May 1st, and that it would take some extraordinary bustling to get the grounds in order. I went over there and asked if there was anything I could do to help. And indeed, there was a lot that CF Seabrook could do to help, starting with the Gladway, which was part of the fairgrounds that he got the contract for. And let's remember that CF was also a nurseryman. The Coster Nursery was fully 1/3 of Seabrook Farms' business. And so the Sesqui also required a lot of last-minute landscaping. CF saw to that. Later, when he sued to collect for this work, someone pointed out that the bushes CF's men had planted around the fairgrounds had no root system. They had simply been scalped from the Costa nursery, brought over and propped up with some dirt on the fairground, so they quickly turned brown and died. And this is again in CF's own words, quote, "The contracts began to multiply and our company was very busy. Finally, I began to wonder, how are we going to get paid? When the Sesqui Organizing Committee went bankrupt in early 1927, many contractors and subcontractors wondered the same thing, how they were going to get paid. But CF had the bright idea of hiring Mayor Kendrick's former law partner, a man named George Clowder, who also happened to be the head of the Sesqui Centennial Creditors Committee, as a kind of private lobbyist for his own interests. CF was frank about this. Quote, "Someone told me George Clowder would actually pay the bills," he said. "I asked him to represent me in the claims we had against the Sesqui." Here are some of those expenses that he claimed. And CF did collect his Sesqui money. Now, had he left the matter there, no further trouble would probably have ensued. But C.F. Seabrook was never content to leave matters there. In Philly, he seems to have aspired to be one of the city's contractor bosses himself. With the help of his Christian lawyer, the state senator A.R. McAllister, who did all of CF's legal works, he organized multiple contracting and construction companies, some with Philadelphia headquarters, all of which concealed his own ownership. His businesses eventually included, in addition to Tri-State, the Good Roads Company, the CF Seabrook Engineering Corp., CF Seabrook Company, the Keystone Machinery and Equipment Company, the Philadelphia Contracting Engineering Company, and a number of other companies. Using George Clowder's insider connections to the organization, CF's firms proceeded to win contract after contract. His Elastic Hose Company sold the city valves for fire hoses at inflated prices. Another company sold the city a supposedly patent kind of steel called multi-steel, which turned out to be ordinary steel with a 200% markup. George Clowder was the go-between in all of these deals. By mid-1928, the scale of graft was getting too much, even for the city of Philadelphia, where Kendrick had now been replaced as mayor by another former law partner of his, Harry Mackey. That summer, Philadelphia City Controller William Hadley and District Attorney Monahan accused C.F. Seabrook of being the, quote, mastermind, unquote, behind a plot to monopolize all city contracts in Philadelphia, using Clowder's connections to the organization. So this story says, Clowder conducted, this is a story actually from the Vineland Daily, the Journal. Clowder conducted a high-pressure sales campaign for the Keystone construction firm, going to the lengths of utilizing stationery of the Mackey Clowder law firm with the mayor's name delicately crossed out to push the interests of the Keystone company with city contractors. The story also notes that, quote, Seabrook was summoned to appear in the office of District Attorney Monahan yesterday, but it is said that Seabrook has left Philadelphia. He left Philadelphia. So then the mayor, Mackey, defends Seabrook initially. And this is from the Philadelphia Inquirer, this story. And I'm quoting, Mayor Mackey angrily pounding a table, thus yesterday resoundingly denounced the controller's probe into city contracts and his disclosures of the activities of the mayor's friend and former law partner, George Clowder. Mackey declared, they talk about C.F. Seabrook, treasurer of the Keystone Machinery and Equipment Company. Seabrook was not a fly-by-night contractor. He was not a thief. He is a big man, and everything he is connected to with has real money of his own behind it, unquote. Now, CF might have been spared the scandal of front-page headlines had he not attracted the interest of a crusading young reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer named Harold J. Wiegand, who was then just at the beginning of a stellar career that would eventually landing on the top of the Philadelphia Inquirer's masthead by the 70s. He wrote, Wiegand, writing for the Inquirer, which was a Republican paper, wrote a series of muckraking articles peeling back the layers of the Seabrook, Mackey combine. Many were on the front page. Local papers picked up the news, and it became a full-blown scandal. Given the amount of publicity these stories generated, it seems remarkable how effectively this episode has been erased from C.F. Seabrook's biography, and it makes me wonder about all the other things we don't know. C.F. did eventually sit down with Philadelphia DA Monahan, in which he told the DA, quote, "A monopoly of city contracts in Philadelphia never occurred to me," unquote. Wiegand did another story about that. C.F. further said, and I think he kind of won the day in some ways just by being quite frank, quote, "There is no mystery about my company in Philadelphia. Mr. Seabrook explained that the Charles F. Seabrook Company is controlled by him, and one is an export being concern, another is a local concern. They recently sold $8,500,000 worth of agricultural road building machinery in Turkey. And he says within the last few days, the main firm procured a $6 million contract for building roads in Europe. A Paris office takes care of the European contracts. And that seems to have been where the matter ended. Perhaps it was all just a big misunderstanding, something to be settled quietly in a manner that was satisfactory to all parties concerned, except perhaps the taxpayers. CF was never charged with a crime, but he was banned from taking part in any more public works in the city of Philadelphia forever after. So, what does C.F. Seabrook do at that point? Well, what does any big-shot American businessman do when he needs an infusion of fresh capital and the usual sources in the U.S. have stopped giving it to him because they don't trust him anymore? Oh, wait a minute. He goes to Russia! Yes, he goes to Russia. This is the contract. This is a contract between CF Seabrook Engineering and the Bolshevik-led Soviet Union, dated 1930, to build 5,000 miles of roads in Moscow. We found it with the help of a Russian researcher and writer who ended up becoming part of the story in the State Economic Archives in Moscow. Seabrook was one of over 40 U.S. engineering firms, equipment makers, and factory designers and operators who the Soviets brought over to help build Joseph Stalin's so-called 5-year plan to modernize Russia, which was launched in 1928. Henry Ford was an unlikely hero to these Soviet leaders. Stalin and his colleagues felt that by employing Fordist methods of production, factories, assembly lines, and Taylor's time-motion studies that would supercharge worker efficiency, that the Soviets would be able to leapfrog the bourgeois phase of development that had corrupted the West and skip right to the higher proletarian phase as outlined by Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. Here were the gentlemen that thought that idea was a good one. The Russian Revolution, of which Lenin was the intellectual architect, occurred in 1917, but the U.S. government didn't recognize the USSR until 1933, when FDR finally established diplomatic relations. Throughout the 1920s, there was no Soviet embassy in the U.S. However, there was growing trade between the two countries. U.S. multinationals like Ford, McCormick, and DuPont saw in the USSR a vast potential market and were eager to make deals with the Soviets, as were the Soviets with them, provided the Americans would accept promissory notes for the work to be paid in future out of Russia's supply of gold bullion, which was the only form of exchange that existed between the two countries. In the absence of a diplomatic outpost, the only quasi-official Soviet representative in the U.S. was the Soviet Trade Organization, which was called AMTOR, short for the American Trading Company, and was based in New York City, first in Wall Street and later on Lower Fifth Avenue. For any American company doing business with the Soviets, Amtorg was the go-between. A partial list of those companies includes Ford Motor Company, General Electric, DuPont Nemours, Newport News Shipbuilding, Dry Dock, Hugh Cooper, many others, steel builders, hydroelectric power makers, Hercules Motor Company, Goodman Manufacturing, and the architect Albert Kahn, who designed the Ford factory, and Seabrook Engineering. Amtorg also became the de facto headquarters of Soviet espionage, which at that point was mainly based around stealing American technology, much as China's military hacking groups do now. So this is actually a video. I don't know if we could get the video to play. There we go. So this is actually a video of them loading some of the American equipment to go to Russia in the 20s. I found this online. You can see the stevedores in the back there. And then the man himself, this is, okay, so this, everything good. It's hard to hear him. His name is Saul Braun. He was the head of Amtorg in New York City from 1927 to 1930. And that's a Yiddish accent, actually, he's speaking. And he's talking about this trade that's going on between the U.S. and the USSR in spite of no diplomatic relations, and how they welcome American engineers over to Russia. This was his family. He lived in New York City on the Upper West Side with his wife and 2 children. And this is him with Henry Ford, which was probably the biggest of the contracts that Amtorg signed, to make Fordson tractors in Russia. That factory was later converted into making tanks that helped stop the German advance on the Russian front in 1943. So I think we did ourselves a good service by building that factory. It is no surprise that C.F. Seabrook, the Henry Ford of agriculture, would be of interest to the Soviets. Who better to help out with Stalin's 5-year plan than the man who had already enacted his own 5-year plan right here in Cumberland County, when with other people's money he built the infrastructure of Seabrook Farms in a 5-year whirlwind of construction between 1912 and 1917. C.F. Seabrook had already transformed a 19th century agrarian society into a 20th century industrial one in Seabrook, New Jersey, back when young Stalin was cooling his heels in a Siberian prison. So he was the man. And this is his passport photo. His passport from this era is incredible. It's so full of the most amazing stamps and delightful looking, passport visas and stuff. And so still we can only marvel at the breathtaking audacity of this Jersey boy who stood 5'8", as you can see. He was only 5'8". To go from building roads around Seabrook Farms to building a third of the Sesqui Centennial was a big step. But for a wannabe Philadelphia contractor boss, one of the top American engineers assisting Joseph Stalin and the Supreme Soviet in building the infrastructure for a modern society of workers is quite an act of what Saul Braun might have called chutzpah. Especially if, like C.F. Seabrook, you weren't actually an engineer at all. Here's some of his stamps from his passport. The Bolsheviks were not the Philadelphia organization. The Supreme Soviet was not a pay-to-play gang. But while the Soviet leaders were not susceptible to bribery, they may have been vulnerable to American PR, another Yankee invention that the Russians took from us and adapted to Soviet-style propaganda. And CF was a master of public relations by the time he and Saul Braun met. And no doubt Seabrook made his newspaper clippings available to Braun, including the Forbes article from 1920 calling him the Henry Ford of agriculture. So perhaps the Soviets thought that since they had already signed up Henry Ford himself, they may as well sign up Henry Ford of Agriculture too. Anyway, that's what they did. And not only did they sign him up, this is from an International Herald Tribune story of 1929, quote, construction contracts totaling $150 million in part fulfillment of the road program recently undertaken by the government of Soviet Russia have been awarded to the CF Seabrook Company, one of the largest road building firms in this country, against strong French and British competition, it was learned recently. The contracts would spread over 6 years and call for construction of 10,000 miles of roads in the province of Moscow, Mr. Seabrook said. It is expected construction will begin next spring. $150 million. I imagine when CF wrote those numbers down, he made them very big indeed. The story also says that the contract includes not just roads, but also canals, docks, irrigation projects, and a host of other infrastructure improvements. That fall, CF had his lead engineer, a man named R. Ettinger Breed, prepare a 78-page report on roads in Moscow and its provinces with detailed proposals of the materials and equipment they would require. His team was assisted by a group of Russian engineers led by a man named Perelatrius, who had a son named Perelatrius Jr. I have a copy of, well, this is the report. I have a copy of the whole thing. It looks very professional and detailed, although I haven't actually had a highway engineer look at it yet. And also in early 1930, CF arranged for a delegation of his Russian engineers to visit Seabrook because they came to the U.S. to tour the great engineering works. Naturally, they had to visit Seabrook Farms, which actually at that point was still called Del Bay Farms, and CF didn't even work there at that point, but he may not have actually pointed that out to them. Anyway, he brought them, showed them around. He also bought a great amount of road building equipment from the companies that he represented, such as Case and Caterpillar, including the latest steamrollers, graders, portable asphalt making machines for paving Moscow streets that had never been paved, and he had it shipped over in some of those boxes you saw loading from the dock there. And since he was working on promise of future payment from the Soviets, he persuaded these equipment makers to accept future payment as well. Now, why would they go for that? Well, it's worth remembering that now we're into October, November 29, the stock market has crashed, triggering the Great Depression. The domestic economy is collapsing. The potential Russian market is looking like it could be kind of a lifeline. And so some of these companies may have been willing to extend credit when they might otherwise have been more cautious, and they would regret it. In the spring of 1930, CF took a team of engineers and workers, including some from the Bridgeton area. A man named Sherrod Kelly was one of them. He was from Millville, actually, and brought them all over to Moscow. The Seabrook crew started paving the Moscow streets in the spring of 1930. In Moscow, CF set up its headquarters in a luxurious Savoy hotel. Isaac Stanley Walker, who was not one of CF's engineers, but he intersected with his team in Moscow, and he wrote about it in a short memoir called A Trip to Russia in 1930. In one of several passages that mentions CF, it sounds as if he is not living in hardship in Moscow. I'll read the passage. June 8, 1930. Dinner party at the Savoy with about 15 of Seabrook's men and Mr. Seabrook. Others included Hitchcock, Nash, Shattuck, Smith, Bessie, Mulligan, Petrolia's seniors and juniors, and Skinner. Very fine dinner. Had a better impression of Russian cooking. Vodka, cognac, wine. In room after dinner with men until 11. When CF returned to Seabrook in August of 1930, he gave a talk at the Rotary Club, the Bridgeton Rotary Club, in which he talked about how the work was going at that point. This is in August of 1930. The newspaper article reads in part, quote, Seabrook said his company is working with the Russian government in the paving of approximate 2,000 miles of streets and roads in the city of Moscow and the province, that the roads vary from the finest type of concrete base roads, asphalt on concrete, oil, macadam, and gravel. That work is progressing in a satisfactory manner. The contract involves the expenditure of $20 million. And continuing from the story, when over in Russia earlier this year, Mr. Seabrook closed another contract for works on roads in Turkestan, Central Asia, and 2,000 laborers are now engaged in grading those roads in the cradle of civilization. Quote, Mr. Seabrook is working on a contract for an irrigation program in the cotton sections of Turkestan involving an expenditure of $100 million by the Soviet government. Excavation has been in progress since last December, and the work involves moving 165 million cubic tons of earth. And finally, Mr. Seabrook said that the Soviet government was stable now and was strong, autocratic only slightly less than Italy. Officials were honest and sincere. Now remember that. Officials were honest and sincere in spite of a lack of general capability. Okay, that's the end of that newspaper story. I have found no record of any of these other contracts, and it's hard to even know where to start looking for them in some cases, but they certainly do sound like big numbers, and as we know, CF did like his numbers big. But sometime between August and November of 1930, something went terribly wrong with the road surfaces that CF's engineers had put down in Moscow. This is a Russian auto journal called Zakh. I don't speak Russian at all, but I happen to know that translates into "Let's roll." It's dated November 22nd, 1930. And they published a picture of the road that CF had supposedly built, and it had completely collapsed. People are walking down into the pit where the road was. This is what that street looks like today. It looks a little nicer. But back then, that was the situation there. The Zarulam had a lot to say about that. So there's an article in there written by a Russian engineer. I'll read part of it. It talks about these roads that fell apart. We saw that Seabrook started the job without taking into consideration the quality of our building materials, which are different from American ones, and conditions of our street traffic, horse-drawn transport. We warned them about it in writing, but they responded, "Never mind, we'll manage," but manage they did not. Why? First, they did not have qualified engineers to train our workers. There were instances when, for example, during excavating, they were completely helpless and had to turn for help to an American excavator operator who had worked for us earlier. Second, they started the job without prior laboratory testing of the materials, using in all instances American compounds not useful under our conditions. I want to add that our contract with the American firm has a clause according to which the Americans not only build the roads, but are also responsible for their quality. At this time, we have filed a lawsuit against Seabrook for the losses in connection with the damages. The engineer concludes, they approached the project in a cavalier manner without a thorough study of all the above-mentioned circumstances, and they could not have done it even if they wanted to, because it would have taken them too much time. But what exactly did happen to the roads? In a book called History of Road Construction and Service in Moscow by A. Luganov, there is this passage referring to CF's company. The American road specialists used a sand asphalt and small and large grain asphalt bitumen along with other compounds that did not include either natural Shugura bitumen or asphalt powder. Such asphalt was used in surfacing the various streets, and it had already begun to deteriorate in 1930. After rain had flaked and cracked, water saturated the road surface of the asphalt. It lost density and easily crumbled under horse-drawn transport. At any rate, the work was a disaster. CF wasn't paid for it, and he may have been sued for it. That meant that all the equipment manufacturers that gave CF their road-making machinery on credit weren't paid either, And many of these companies have evidently sued CF Seabrook Engineering too, back here in the U.S. for payment, although we have yet to find any of those lawsuits. It's also unclear whether any of the Seabrook engineers were paid. I suspect by the pall of silence that falls over this project after November 1930 that they were not. In fact, it's a testament to C.F. Seabrook's Soviet-style control of his official biography that we have to go all the way to the Soviet archives in Moscow even to find anything about this stuff. My father's older brother Belfort says in an unpublished memoir that C.F. went back to the USSR in 1931 to collect the funds owed to him and was away for 11 months. But whether he was successful in collecting or not, we don't know. We do know that many of the other larger engineering firms that signed amateur contracts did not get paid either because the Soviets were worried about further depleting their supply of bullion. On August 25th, 1931, Stalin called for a definitive break with all American engineering and contracting companies, saying, quote, "Due to difficulties with hard currency and unacceptable credit terms, I propose to ban placement of new orders in America, call off any negotiations for new orders that have already begun, and, whenever possible, terminate the contracts for orders which have already been negotiated, transferring those orders to Europe or other plants. I propose to make no exceptions." So I suspect CF never did collect, and with that, his contracting career was effectively over. Certainly his rosy view of the communists that CF had expressed at the Rotary Club in August 1930 hardened after 1932, and by the time of the 1934 strikes at Seabrook, CF was an ardent anti-communist who blamed outside agitators for turning his work against them, and you can see what he thought about their honesty, too. However, although Stalin stiffed him, CF may not have returned from Russia empty-handed. According to family tradition, one night when CF was in St. Petersburg trying to collect his money, a Soviet official brought him into the former Tsar Nicholas II's wine cellar at the Winter Palace and allowed him to pick out a priceless jeweled bottle of wine, which CF brought back to the Pope Lane house and kept in his cellar. But if that's true, we have never found them. If any of you have it, please let us know. You can just stop in and drop it off at the SCCC anytime. But with characteristic energy, as the Russian job was going pear-shaped, CF was organizing yet another venture, a group of investors who bought back the assets of Seabrook Farm from the receiver in 1930. He actually organized all of that when he was back here for the Rotary Club, and he took over the farming business again. Certainly CF made out a lot better than Saul Braun and his family. In 1938, after returning to Russia, Braun was arrested and charged with being a foreign spy, forced to sign a fake confession, and shot. His body was dumped in a mass grave. His wife was placed in a prison camp where she died, never seeing their two children again. The Soviet engineers who visited Seabrook Farms in 1930 were all reportedly liquidated too, including both Petralius Sr. and Jr. I know a lot of this because I found this paper by Sonia Melenkova-Rush, and Sonia is also the person who helped me with the Russian State Archives, where I found CF's contract. What I didn't know until I started corresponding with Sonia, had been corresponding with her for a while, was that Saul Braun was her great uncle. And when I went to see her in San Francisco, Sonia told me the moving story of how when she was a child, no one would speak of her great uncle, who was still a non-person in the early 50s. But by the late 50s, he had been rehabilitated, and Sonia began to learn about the important role her ancestor had played in the early history of the Soviet state, just as I was learning about the somewhat less distinguished role my ancestor had played in it. She served me lunch in her apartment, and we looked through pictures of her ancestors, including the confession Braun was made to sign admitting to his false charges of espionage, which Sonia had also obtained from the state archives. Sonia also gave me this picture of the apartment building in Manhattan where the family had lived in the 1920s, but she didn't know where it was. She just had these two pictures. And so I came back to New York, and with some detective work and with the help of Google Maps, I was actually able to figure out it's this building. Actually, here, I even put them together for Sonia. The old building and the new building. And it was actually a very emotional moment. You know, when you find that stuff. Here's the porch, you know. It was exciting to find the porch where the bronze were standing, but it was sad too, because I felt like I was 90 years too late, and they were gone. But maybe what I'm doing now is trying to save them, at least in my own way, at least their memory, and meeting Sonia and helping each other with our separate projects of our ancestors does give the Saul Braun and C.F. Seabrook story a somewhat happier ending than the one in which everybody gets shot, except for C.F. So, finally, what are we to make of C.F. Seabrook's contracting career? It certainly sounds like he messed up in Moscow. In Philadelphia, he allowed hubris to get the better of him. But while you do have to wonder about his moral compass, you can't doubt his ambition, his drive, his energy, or his imagination. He may have misrepresented his abilities, but if so, he would not be the only great man who did. Thomas Edison himself lied about inventing the incandescent light bulb for years before he actually come up with one that worked. Fake it till you make it, as they say in Silicon Valley. So I'm inclined to cut the old man a break here. The Roaring '20s were a glorious decade for him, warts and all, and he roared with it. The '30s, which sees the beginning of Seabrook Farms 2, is going to be a much darker decade for C.F. Seabrook, as this last stamp in his passport from this era of 1937 foreshadows. In Seabrook Farms 2, the old man from Seabrook Farms 1, now 10 years older, will encounter labor unions and civil rights, and he won't like it at all. There will be blood. But for the next installment in this lecture series, I will go back to the beginning of the story of CF and his father, AP, and introduce a third very important character, AP's younger brother, Albert, the longtime Seabrook Farms treasurer and secretary known as Uncle Bert. That lecture will be on Saturday, April 27th, 1 p.m. as part of the Community Day at SECC. And that concludes my presentation. I'm sorry it took so long. Please feel free to go if you have to, but if you want to ask questions, I'm happy to stay. Thank you.
What year did they actually start the fast freeze process?
So, Clarence Birdseye invented the fast freeze. Clarence Birdseye had spent a lot of time in Labrador, and he had seen the Eskimos pulling the fish out of the water and how they froze right on the spot. And so he saw that as a way of preserving fish and chicken he worked on. CF somehow, he lived in Gloucester, Massachusetts, so CF met up with him, heard about him, maybe read about him, and Seabrook had these giant ice-making or freezers that they would use to chill the fresh vegetables with, and they converted those to these giant plates that they could make frozen, use the quick freezing process that Birdseye had developed, and that was in the early 30s. Sort of 34, 35, but it wasn't really until World War II when the Seabrook sold the Army on using frozen food rather than canned food because it was lighter and it saved metal, and then the soldiers got used to frozen food, and then when they came back, they told their wives about it, and that's when the Seabrook brand then sort of took off in the later 40s.
Saul, was he connected to the Rothschilds?
Who's that?
Saul.
Oh, Saul Braun? I don't know.
Okay.
I've heard that.
And just a question, Kim. And the two rail spurs, Well, I assume one of them is the one that's still there.
Yeah, exactly.
Where was the other one?
Not sure. I guess they took it out.
Okay.
We'll have to figure that out, I guess. Maybe it's on an old map somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the valley there. Hey,
When are you gonna tell a story about the hanger-on lawyer and plotting to take over the company, and then the guy sells it under there without realizing what he was doing? Is that?
That's the
guy
end.
also?
You're talking about, which lawyer are you talking about?
Well, there was a lawyer, and the family, the younger members were plotting to declare the owner insane so they could take over.
That's the end.
Okay.
You're into the end. You can't know the end until you can't understand the end until you understand the beginning.
All right. Well,
You gotta come for this one, and
I'm not
then
gonna give anything away. Is that what you're gonna do?
that's the beginning. You're gonna start to understand the end.
You told me.
I'm gonna take my time. This is my story, man. Yes.
Bring over White Russians, I thought I read that somewhere.
Well, yeah, this phrase "White Russians" was used a lot, but really, and it's possible that it is true that after, there was a civil war in Russia after the revolution, and there were the Reds and the Whites, and the Reds won and the Whites lost, and so there was a large group of refugees. Some of them may have come, but I've actually never documented an individual with a name that you could trace. I think a lot of it maybe got mixed up later in the Second World War when a lot of Eastern Europeans, Estonians, a lot of Estonians came, Lithuanians came, a number of people who might have been called White Russians, 30 years ago, came. And maybe it got partly mixed up with that, or it's possible that I just haven't found some of these people that did come in that period. But mainly it seems like it was, if you look at the census records, we're going to go through this on this talk, but all of the workers living there in those early days were Italian names. It seems like he got almost all of his workers. It came through, Port of Gloucester was the second biggest port for immigrants after, well, it was before Ellis Island, but after New York, Gloucester was the second biggest port, and I think he recruited right from the port. He had notices up that you could find employment down, and if you came down to South Jersey, you could get a job, and that's where many of his workers came from then. Yeah.
Hi. Do you know exactly where Seabrook was born?
Yeah, I know exactly where he was born. I can't, in the top of my head, pull off the name of that street, but it's right next to B.B. Run, and the house.
Minch's Lane.
What's that?
Minch's Lane.
Minch's Lane.
I have it right here.
There it is. You own the house. You own the house?
We own that
Oh, you
house.
bought it a few years ago, or?
Yeah, we bought it 5 years ago.
Oh, yeah. I looked at it on the real estate bookings. Yeah, I know all the rooms.
This is from 1954, and that's when the people we bought it from bought it.
Okay.
So we were told that C.F. Seabrook was born at that
He
house,
was.
so that would have been 1881. The house was built in the 1730s, and the newest edition is 1774. That's the new edition. But I'll send you a copy.
Love to, yeah, I'd love to see that. I just have the, like I said, I was off of the real estate. They have all the rooms listed, so I did a virtual tour. My grandfather.
You can do a real tour.
I did actually kind of pull over on the side of the road once and kind of took a look.
We've been restoring it. It unfortunately was in kind of, had fallen.
Yeah,
What's your house number?
Pardon?
What's your house number?
230 Minch's Corner Road.
that's it, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
We didn't even know where his house was until a few years ago, and then we kind of figured it out.
We've been diligently propping it up.
See, that's the kind of thing, like, CF had things that he wanted you to remember, and then he had things he didn't want you to remember, and he didn't want people to know, I think he was born in that house.
It is. It's a very humble, small house. The 1730s part would be stone, the rest of it's brick,
Yeah.
but it had bank barns and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They've all collapsed and they're gone.
You know, in the Seabrook Museum, we have this big piece of board that he carved. See, I don't know if you've been in there, but it's from your property. There was an old shed, a wagon shed on your property, and when he was a boy, he carved his name. He also made his letters pretty big too. He carved his big CF Seabrook in the side of the, and we have it at the museum right when you walk in. If you stop in over Deerfield, you can see it there.
Are you next to Joe Shoemaker?
Yeah, he's my neighbor across the street, yeah,
I know exactly where you are.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
How many total lectures will there be before you get into the 50s where all the people came from Germany, from Europe?
That's going to be my, I can only pick two out. We have this one, and then I want to go to the strikes of 1934, so I think it's going to be the fourth one maybe after that.
Fort Hope.
Yeah, I was also going to be there in the Second World War with all the sort of Japanese American stuff, so it's a lot of stuff. I mean, the Japanese American piece is the piece we know the most about because, you know, the work has been done by a lot of folks. But all these other groups we really don't know much about, and that's kind of what we're trying to put together now. Yes?
Well, my parent, for example, the European, you were talking about the Russians and all that, after the war, they all settled in Germany. That was sort of the point where everybody settled from
Yeah.
Eastern Europe. And then around 1949 and 50s era, that's when all the people from so-called Europe came over. And Seabrook actually recruited in Germany because in those days you needed a sponsor and a job to come to America.
Yeah.
It's not like it is today. So the Estonian group were the first ones to come over around early 1950. And then later the Germans were allowed because that had to do with the DP status.
Okay.
And around 51 and 52 is when that group started coming over.
Okay.
And that's the group where my parents came, so I know a lot about that.
Okay. Yeah, you know, there's a filmmaker who's going to be at our July Oban Festival in July who wants to make a film about the Estonian piece of the Seabrook story. So if you were around that, it's July 20th, I think. She'll be there and she wants to film and collect a lot of Estonian stories. It seems like a great project. Yes?
If you want to find out about the White Russians, Jim Seabrook, the farm, one of the farms he owns is on Northville Road. The farm is called Pollock Hotel.
Yes.
Down on the end of the huge farmhouse.
Progressive word.
Yeah, we farm
Okay.
on Northville Road.
Pollock Hotel. Okay, I got it.
Yes, do you still have Jack's yellow and black stagecoach?
No, my father wisely had a great, huge auction for his carriages and his harness, and he basically sold it all in a 2-day extravaganza just before they left Salem and went down to live in South Carolina. So I don't know who bought that one in particular, but it's somewhere out there. A lot of people from California bought those rigs, so it might be out there. The Nimrod, which was his prize, is in Newport, Rhode Island, in somewhere in like a preservation society or something up there.
It was a beautiful stagecoach, and I liked, he had the funeral carriages, the etched glass and the side windows. It's really a beautiful collection.
Incredible. You know, we wouldn't have been able to do anything with it. I think you did the right thing to get it into the hands of the people that wanted to keep it up.
And going back to the roads in Russia, the part reason for that to collapse like that, I've been in those extreme conditions. The road would freeze at 40 below zero, and then you would have a wind chill factor that could be 40 to 80 miles an hour.
Yeah.
And I suspect that that road collapsed because not just the hoofs from the horses and mules, but the extreme expansion of the ground from the temperatures.
Right. Yeah,
Contracting and then expanding in the summer.
Exactly.
It might not have been faulty engineering, it might have just been the extreme.
Right. I think so, yes.
One more question, Don. Are you going to bring your band down for community?
It's all the band for community now, yeah. And, you know, we're looking for gigs, and if this is like CF, where you book your own, you know. I'm like a chip off the old block here. I'm gonna put myself into this thing.
Something the Estonian filmmaker, well, she's not Estonian,
She's Dutch, I think.
Yes, Dutch. She's Dutch, and she's interested in the Estonian element, but not just the Estonian element.
Okay.
She's actually interested in the fact that Seabrook Farms was a place where people who had been displaced for reasons beyond their control and their desire came together and were accepted by a community that had really no knowledge of them and no particular interest in receiving them, other than they were there. And she will be coming here, and she will be very interested in talking to people, not just the people who came here, but also the people who were living here or descendants of those people, to see how the community accepted this people. And she said, and one of her interests is that this has contemporary resonance, that these were refugees at that time, and at that time the refugees in Europe were the largest number of refugees that the world had experienced for a long time. Now, we have refugees that go way beyond the number that were in Europe after the Second World War. And especially in Europe, other places as well, the same problem is apparent. People show up. What do you do to these people?
Well, it seems like a lot of, there were a few companies that were willing to sponsor people.
In those days you had to, now they come over illegally, but in those days you couldn't.
But a lot of people wanted to come here, but couldn't because they didn't sponsor them.
And speaking of the multicultural, I remember as a kid, I was probably around 12 at that time, there was a store right in the village, the Europeans used to call it the Japanese store.
Yeah.
That's no longer there, they tore it down. But I remember going in the store with my mother because we used to get German bread every Tuesday. It would be delivered from Philadelphia, a German bakery. And you'd meet like people from Estonia, from Latvia, from Russia. Nobody spoke English, but since they all spent a lot of time in Germany, or studied German in their home countries, in college maybe, they would speak German with each other, and I always found that to be amazing. You know, nobody spoke English, but yet you hear the Estonian talking to a Latvian, or a Russian talking to whatever, but they were speaking German. So that really stood out to me as a kid.
That's cool. Yeah, Evan.
So,
you were the third, by the way, right here.
he was my great-grandfather, and he died before I was born, so I was named after him and my father. Within all the family stories and lore, I can't think of a single warm story about CF.
Yeah, it's hard to find them.
Yeah. Obviously, there was some bitterness there, but it'd be nice, I mean, if it's true, that you could find some warmth.
Let's look for a
nice, kind story.
I found a poem that a guy wrote. The next time, he calls him his friend. So, I mean, I think that, it's hard to know exactly what was behind some of that sort of negative energy. And I think it changed, too. I mean, I knew him when he was at the end of his life. You never met him.
Yeah, he died 5 years before.
Yeah. He was pretty sick. It was hard to know what his vigorous young self would have been like. That's kind of what I'm trying to bring back to life a little bit here. Yeah. Somebody else have a question?
John Fayette.
Sorry.
John Fayette said he could be the devil or an angel.
Yeah.
The situation.
Yeah, it's true.
The last picture you showed of the passport was of a Third Reich stamp. What was he doing in Hitler's Germany?
Good question. He did have a Berlin office, so I'm thinking he was closing up his office. I think the Russia stuff, because the passport, he always goes through Germany to get to Russia. So I think that was like the nearest sort of Western base of operations for his Moscow activities, and he had an office there. So I'm thinking they went and closed up the office. I'm hoping he didn't go for early meeting with like the Third Reich leaders.
There might have been an economic opportunity of some sort, except that.
Well, let's not even go there. Whatever we're going to talk about. Yeah. So it is, but it is kind of a haunting stamp, and that swastika down there.
Well, it was before the war, though.
It was before the war. Yes.
Are you aware that Henry Ford went to an engineering meeting in Atlantic City and didn't have any money to get home?
Is that right?
And CFC loaned him the money to get back to Detroit or where it was.
Is that right? I never heard that.
And he paid CF stock. And we figured out one time in the wintertime we didn't have anything to do, but that stock had been worth it, held on to it, you know, it was astronomical.
Okay, so we got those stock certificates around, we want those too, right?
I think the answer to Ivan's question is that you have to look outside the family to see how many thousand other people were lifted up
Right.
by things that he did and accomplished.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, he was the change agent that made all this stuff happen, and good and bad happened with it, but it wouldn't happen without him.
No.
That's for sure.
And it was a different time.
Yeah.
Different time, and if you weren't aggressive, you didn't survive.
Right.
Where's Jack Berry?
He's right over in Deerfield, right near CF and the rest of them. You know, my mother's over there too. I'll be over there one of these days. Not too long.
I looked at it 3 days ago. It's been 10 years.
Yeah, I gotta put some flowers over there, I think. But yeah, we have the Seabrook obelisk there in the Deerfield Presbyterian Church. The one person we're missing, and this is also going to feature next time, is the guy who got us here, the guy who brought us all down here, Samuel Seabrook, CF's grandfather, who was a ne'er-do-well guy who saw an ad that Charles Landis put in the newspaper for land, and you know, managed to get 12 acres for no money down. Defaulted on his mortgage, got kicked out of Vineland, which may be why the Vineland newspaper went always so hard. Seems to be some bad blood there. And then he was the one that came over here to Deerfield. He died 3 years after he got here, and supposedly was buried in strangers' graves, which my uncle said was called strangers' graves in the Deerfield Presbyterian Cemetery. But the sexton hasn't even heard of strangers' graves, so we don't know even where he is. And I hope to make a stone for him in that area where the Seabrook obelisk is too.
John, there is such an area in Presbyterian cemeteries called Strangers Road. We have one at Broad Street.
That one on Broad, this is the one I'm talking about, the one in Deerfield.
Yeah, I'm sure there must be one in there.
Yeah, I'm sure there was. It was really near the water because the stone was washed away or something. Anyway, I haven't figured that out either. There's a lot of mysteries.
Where did he come from, his grandfather?
His grandfather came from England. He came over in 1859 he was just a poor immigrant, really. His father had been a Church of England preacher. And been educated. So there was a tradition of education, and he could read. Samuel could read. And when he got to New York, he somehow got a job as looking after cows up the Hudson around Rhinecliff. And he spent a few years there, and then he saw one of these ads that, you know, Landis put ads all around in the newspapers, and that's what, you know, he came down here in 1867. So we basically do revivals here compared to you folks. I'm sure whose families go like back to the early settlers. We're basically immigrants. In fact, CF's father was born in England. He came over when he was 5 years old, so he was actually born in England. Yeah.
My great-grandpop and my grandpop started with CF in the 20s. On peas and baby llamas. And then as time went on, my grandpa had 4 sons. They kept growing for him. And my brother and I came along, and we worked for my pop and grandpop and uncles. And as it went on, Henry and I grew up and became brothers today.
Nice. So you've been together all this time.
I'm ready.